Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Terry Highland. I'm a community liaison with the Visiting Nurse and Hospice for Vermont and New Hampshire. And I'm privileged today to be joined by Gary Shapiro, who is a spiritual care counselor with VNH, as well as our volunteer and bereavement coordinator. Gary, nice to see you.
Nice to be here.
So today, everybody, we're going to be talking about volunteering at VNH. And I encourage anyone watching to go ahead and post comments. I'll be able to see those as they come through. And if you have a question, that's a great way to do that. Post a comment and we'll answer those questions at the end of our presentation. So, Gary, let's go ahead and begin. Tell me, how long have you been with VNH and describe your role here for me?
Well, I joined VNH a little more than 4 years ago in March of 2017. And I was hired to be a spiritual care counselor, or as is more commonly known as chaplain, where I'm part of the hospice team along with the nurses and social worker and home health aides. And basically, I deal with sort of the emotional, spiritual aspects of someone's care because VNH's hospice care is holistic in the sense that we're attending to not just the body but also the mind and the spirit. So I work with people in those ways, and a lot of it is really companionship. Just being with people, being a good listener, and witnessing, being there for them. So more recently, just a few months ago, I became the volunteer and bereavement coordinator. And I know we're going to focus on the volunteering part. So that's, I'm in charge of the volunteer program, which is in a state of evolution, shall we say, and change. We'll get more into that.
Yeah, and that's perfect. It leads me right into my next question because I have to assume, with COVID happening, hospice volunteers often did their work bedside in people's homes. So how has COVID affected volunteerism at VNH?
Well, we had to shut down the program essentially about a year ago when the pandemic hit. Um, and now we're in the process of getting it restarted. There has been some contact between the volunteers and patients and their families through telephone, but essentially we have not been able to do the visits, for health and safety reasons. But now that's starting to shift, and we're looking at ways that we can resume that part of it, as well as other things that volunteers can do, ways that they can connect with patients and families without visiting the home. But it's been, it's been really tough for families, the patients, and the volunteers, so that the connections that they had were, have been disrupted by the pandemic, as has so many things in our lives.
Yeah, and I imagine so the volunteers must have made a connection with the entire family, like you mentioned. It's a huge part of the hospice process. And I would say it seems like both chaplaincy, which you're, well versed in with us, and volunteerism are equally as important to hospice as the medical care that VNH Hospice can provide. So can you describe a little more for me exactly how volunteers work with the hospice patients and their families, and maybe what their visit might normally look like?
Mm-hmm. Well, the volunteers play a really important role because as devoted as the team is, and as much as we do, we can only be there a really short time, visited maybe a half hour, something like that. Volunteers are there longer. Volunteers, can build a very strong relationship with patients and families. And that's essentially what a volunteer visit or any kind of interaction is. It is a relationship. It is in connecting and engaging with patients and their families. It's, if we talk about, sort of the typical visit, I mean, they're all, obviously every visit is different, but it's coming in and like, how are you doing? How has your week been? and just being a listener, and for the patient and families to be able to say whatever's on their mind. So in that sense, volunteer is a little like a chaplain in how we are there to listen, but they're also there to do practical things, like maybe running errands, maybe doing a
Mm-hmm.
little house cleaning, maybe making phone calls. So it's both that sense of being there as a companion, as a listener, and to offer practical support, because that often is what patients and families need so much of, because the needs, and they're often overwhelmed, and our volunteers can really help
Mm-hmm.
ease that sense of, and take some of the load off of the family and other caregivers.
Yeah, it sounds wonderful. So a volunteer, if I were to sum it up, could even almost become part of the family as a new family member in that sense, and bear some of that weight that everybody must be feeling at end of life. It sounds great.
Yeah, they become very close.
Mhm.
That's what our volunteers talk about, how close they are with the families, and
Yeah.
really sharing in what's going on.
Well, that's great because it actually leads me right up to my next question, which was, in that volunteers must become really friendly with their hospice patients and families. What about after the patient passes? Are volunteers allowed to? Are they, encouraged to stay in touch with the family after that?
They are, yes,
Yeah.
and one of the roles for volunteers is to offer bereavement support, to talk with the families, to be there as a listener, because the volunteers have gotten to know them to whatever extent, and so it makes sense that the volunteer can offer that kind of support, can already has that relationship. um, so for the volunteer, it's for many times it's like losing someone that they've been very
Mhm.
close to. So they're involved in it, if for no other reason than they feel it personally. And I've heard this from a number of our volunteers. One of them put it, they said, be prepared to be moved, you know, that it's, this is obviously much more than a sort of a business arrangement, or some kind of, or even though there's practical work involved, it's much more than the work. It's a kind of a heart to heart thing. So volunteers feel a connection with the family, and in most cases they want to, try to keep that connection however they can, and of course, to the extent that the family wants that.
And that's a great point. So the way volunteer visits are structured, the way all of our hospice is structured, is totally dependent on the family and patient's needs. We're not going to force them to do any sort of frequency or collaboration with volunteers or any part of the team. It's totally dependent on what they want.
Absolutely, yeah. The patient and family, they run the show.
Great.
We're there for them. You
Mhm.
know.
I think that's a great thing for people to hear because I've for those of you that don't know, my role as community liaison, I often meet the families at the very beginning of their transition to hospice with us. And those are questions that I get a lot. It's like, what about frequency? What about what the plan of care looks like? How many people do we have to see a week? Does it have to be a lot? And the simple answer is no.
Right. It doesn't have to be anything other than what they need and want. So we really take our cues from them.
Great. And so we mentioned a little bit the practical work involved in being a volunteer. I think that leads me well into my next question. And my question was, what sort of training is involved in becoming a hospice volunteer? Obviously, people are supported. We don't just have them sign up and then sit them down with a family. And how does VNH help someone through that training process?
Well, first of all, it's really important for volunteers to understand what hospice is all about. And I mean, most of us know that hospice has to do with being with people when they're dying, but there's a lot to it. What is the hospice philosophy? What is it? What are we doing? Well, hospice is about comfort care. It's about supporting patients and families to have a peaceful, meaningful end of life. All of that. So it's important for volunteers to get that. Um, and then, the heart of the job, as I was mentioning before, is about the listening, the companioning, some people have, a natural inclination towards that. They're naturally good at that, but not everyone, and all of us need to understand and learn some of the basics of what is it to listen to someone. We often use the term active listening. We're really there listening. We're not like thinking about, okay, what do I need or what am I going to say, but just taking it in. Those are skills that need to be developed. So, listening communication skills are really important. We also training also involves, how do we take care of ourselves? Because if we don't take care of ourselves, we can't take care of someone else. I mean, this goes for everyone involved in hospice. um, so what are the, how do we recognize in ourselves what we need and how we best can care for ourselves? And what do we do if we start feeling overwhelmed, burned out, stressed, taking on, maybe in an emotional sense, taking on more than we can really handle? So it's important to understand that and how to deal with that. We're working with families, and we all know that families can be complicated. There's family dynamics, and so understanding some of the basics around that, and how families operate, and particularly how, a family is a system, and when that system is stressed at a time of great difficulty, like a loved one, being seriously ill, like, how does that affect things? So it's important to know all that. There's a lot of, we also, the training also involves around death and dying. Like, what is the dying process like? There are many different aspects to that we want our volunteers to know, both on the physical and the emotional, spiritual level, how things evolve as the dying process, continues. Also around grief and bereavement, what is the best way to support people in grief? We, the many people kind of have this model of, sympathy. We want to be sympathetic. Of course, we do want to be sympathetic, but it's much more than that. How we're there, how we are truly there for families, listening, letting them go through what they need to go through, and not trying to, say, oh, don't be sad or don't cry or anything like that. We do not want to say that, because crying and being sad and going through all kinds of emotions is part of the healing process, and we want to support that. So really important for volunteers to know all of that. And then the training also involves, there's some sort of nuts and bolts work around documentation, around meeting certain requirements of Medicare, because hospice is within the Medicare system, is supported by Medicare. So the training is, there's a lot involved, and we try to structure the training in a way that it's not too overwhelming. It's comprehensive, but it's not overwhelming. And we generally do it over a series of weeks. So there's, a few hours every week is the kind of standard model that enables people to sort of take in things little by little. And it's very interactive, it's hands-on. And we try to really look at real situations that might happen, do some role plays, things like that, so people really have a taste for it. It's not intellectual stuff. It's not cramming a bunch of knowledge into your head, but really having the experience to help prepare people to be volunteers.
Yeah, thank you. That's wonderful. And, I think you definitely covered it all. And it leads me again into my next question. you know, the volunteers have a lot to learn. They have to act together as a community. And, would you call hospice volunteers, at least within VNH, a community? And what sort of ongoing connections do you think volunteers have with both one another and with you? Would you say that, you guys create your own little family within VNH?
I would say so. Yes, I think I think we're definitely a community. When you're doing work like this, this with really working on a deep emotional level and this kind of sharing heart to heart connection, it bonds you. It certainly has bonded me to the community I'm in of my fellow hospice workers, and similarly with volunteers, we all the each volunteers they experience something that only another volunteer would really get. So that bonds you, and it's also, to the extent that volunteers have an opportunity to talk to one another, and we're trying to encourage, ongoing connection and monthly meetings, things like that. People have an opportunity to share stories, without, I mean, obviously keeping confidentiality in that, but to share their experience, and that's very helpful to be able to process with people who they'll get it. We get what each other is going through, and so that creates a strong bond, and we're there to support each other, to lean on each other. So that, to me, that does make it a community.
Yeah, thank you. Excuse me. So we've covered a lot, and I would like to move into some closing questions and see if maybe we have any questions from the audience. But one that I want to ask is, what is something you think someone may know that we didn't cover already, may not know about hospice volunteering? Something maybe surprising.
Oh, well, I mean, people going into this, they may not realize how much they're going to be affected and moved by this. So prepare to be moved. Prepared, maybe to not over dramatize it, but prepare to have your foundations a little bit shaken in a good way, to open up to something deeper in life. And be prepared to deal with surprises, because as much as we can kind of lay it out like, okay, here's the things to do, and here's understanding family dynamics and all, there's no way to predict what's going to happen at any given visit. There's no way to predict where the patient is going to be at. And volunteer was telling me, well, I go there and the person's sleeping, half the times I go there. So, and even though, they made the appointment for a certain time, but, the patients, they're operating on what's going on with their body and mind, and so they may be sleeping, they may not be able to communicate very well. There may be dementia involved, so it's not going to be simple at times, and so I'd say prepare to be resourceful, creative, and go with the flow. You know.
And I
um,
can echo that, Gary, because what I've learned with my experiences in VNH hospice, going in, talking to these people approaching end of life and their families, is it is moving, but in a good way. I think that was a great, simple way of putting it that you did earlier there. It's moving, and it'll shake your foundations in a good way. And it's really nice as an individual to think about end of life when you're not already there, and it allows you to really truly understand what is the human experience. So I think that was a great way to sum it up. um, what
the one other thing I would say about it, that people may not know going into it, is the question of boundaries.
mm,
um, we can get a little too far in before we realize it, that and it's important to have good boundaries in terms of emotional boundaries as to, you know, how far you can put yourself into it, and there are, and in a practical sense, there may be times when you need to say, no, I can't do that, or I need to wait another week or so before I can come back, because I just, this is just, I'm just going through a lot. So um I think understanding about boundaries, and really being uh, attuned to your boundaries is something that people may not realize before they are in that situation.
No, and that's a great point, both yours and their boundaries. And of course, that's what you are available for to help people work through, and the training is available for. So, of course,
Mhm.
people would be guided through that process of understanding them. Um, so, what would you say to someone who was considering hospice volunteering in the past, but never took that step and went and did it?
I'd say go for it. And and as you go for it, really tune into yourself, tune into what is important to you, tune into what are your strengths, what are your challenges. Be real with yourself. It's a wonderful idea to volunteer, but go within and check it out and say, what is this, what might this be like, what may come up for me, perhaps, if if you've had particularly recent experiences where you've lost a loved one, that can obviously impact on what it's going to be like for you. So go into it with your eyes wide open, but go into it, and with the expectation that you will be moved, that you will grow, that you will learn, and that it will transform you in a really wonderful way.
Great, thank
And,
you.
and also go into it knowing that you will have a lot of support.
Hmm.
Myself as the volunteer coordinator, but really the whole team, that because you're working with nurses and the social worker and home health aides. We're all there to help each other. So even though you may be in your visits, you may be alone with the patient or your family, you are not alone, in the sense that we're all in this together.
Yeah, great. And Gary, I think what I'll do, I'll ask you a final question, and to further inspire people, what's your favorite moment from working in hospice?
Well, my favorite moment, when I'm with the patient and their families, and we can just be in the moment. It's like time, when time stops, when it's not like, oh, this is a seriously ill person who has limited time left, but here we are, we're sharing a laugh about some joke, or they're telling a story about some aspect of their life, or and it's just this feeling of, here we are together, and it's this sense of being in the moment, and sharing about life, or being into life. People associate hospice with dying, and yes, of course, we are dealing with people at end of life, but to me, hospice is about living, is about how we make the most of life, how we live life to the fullest as best we can. And so those moments when we're doing that are just precious. And it's how I want to live my life to the very last breath. And I'm so inspired by the people who are, you know, terminally ill, who are, you know, knocking on heaven's door, to use that expression, and they are able to be fully alive in the moment. It's beautiful, and it's awesome.
Yeah, thank you, Gary. And what's funny is probably would have the exact same answer. I've sat through bereavement discussions led by other chaplains with VNH. I've presented other end of life talks and films with people, and it is a truly great moment when you can let the world behind you fall away and just think about living in that moment. Yeah. So great answer, and I thank you for that. So I think what we're going to do now is go ahead and close out our discussion for today. But again, thank you so much for telling everybody about what it is to be a volunteer at VNH. And I'd like to tell anybody watching again, we would love to have more volunteers at VNH. As Gary mentioned at the beginning, we're restarting the program now after some of the difficulties with COVID-19. So please feel free to reach out. There's an email in the chat that's vnh@vnhcare.org. And you can express your interest in talking to Gary, and I'm sure he'd be happy to do that with you.
I'd be delighted. I'd love to hear from people.
Great. Okay, well, thank you, Gary, and thanks everybody for watching. And we hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
And thank you, Jerry.